I don't know if you're going to get your Bibles and let us begin our study for today. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark and the story of Jesus and his disciples, and some of the way that the Gospel of Mark is written, some of the literary structures. When we look in the central portion of Mark, there are two stories I want to highlight, and these two stories are both about blind men healed by Jesus. And within these two stories, there's some interesting things. These two stories are like brackets that surround the central part of Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Let's consider the first story. In Mark chapter 8, let us read that story. It's about a blind man healed by Jesus. In Mark chapter 22, and we're going to read down to 26, it says, "And he came to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught.
Mm.
And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. After that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up. And he was restored and saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell it to any in the town."
Mm.
So this is the first story. And then we have the central part of Mark up to the second story. We're going to talk about what's in between in a while, but first let's go to the second story. It comes from Mark chapter 10, verse 46. And this time they came to Jericho, and he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great number of people. Blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timotheus, not sure if I spelled that right, Timotheus, sat by the highway side begging. And when he had heard that when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. And many charged him that he should hold his peace. But he cried the more, a great deal, thou son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. And they called the blind man, saying unto him, be of good comfort, rise. And he calleth thee. And he, casting away his garment, rose and came to Jesus. And Jesus answered and said unto him, what wilt thou I should do unto thee?
Mm.
The blind man said unto him, Lord, that I might receive my sight. And Jesus said unto him, go thy way, thy faith has made thee whole. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus in the way. So that's two stories.
Yeah.
Two blind men. And you know what is inside these two stories? It's all about the 12 disciples and their spiritual blindness. It's interesting. So it's like bracketing this central portion of Mark, and then we go on to all the stories about, well, all the information about Jesus trying to heal the blindness of the disciples, their spiritual blindness. So we could talk more about this. But let's talk something about these two stories first. You notice these two blind men, they are like opposites. The first blind man, we don't know him. He's an unknown man. The second blind man, we know who he was, Bartimaeus, his name. Yes. It doesn't seem like the first blind man knew about Jesus, because other people brought him to Jesus and pleaded for his healing.
Mm.
Whereas Bartimaeus is opposite. He knew about Jesus, and he was calling Jesus, "Thou son of David." He pleads for healing, for his own healing. No one brought him to, well, he was reaching to Jesus already, but the people actually tried to stop him from coming to Jesus. They said, "Be quiet." And so it's a bit opposite than the other one. And you notice the other one, it requires 2 touches from Jesus before there's the final healing. At first he sees, obviously he doesn't see clearly. And after the second touch of Jesus, he sees clearly. Whereas Bartimaeus, the healing is just by faith. It's just as faith. Your faith has healed you, Jesus says. And then we know the location of both. One is Bethsaida at the top of the Lake of Galilee, and this other healing is in Jericho down in Judea.
Yeah.
So these 2 healings are like the opposite thing going on, and which is interesting in itself. And so the theme of this part of Mark is blindness, physical blindness representing spiritual blindness within the brackets, if you like. So let's talk about the spiritual blindness of the people in that day. The people believed in the coming Messiah, but they believed in a warlike Messiah that would overthrow their oppressors and establish the earthly kingdom of Israel, and that it would be more glorious and more powerful than all the other kingdoms, and that they would rule the world. Sounds like the plot of a strange story, where a villainous character, "I'm going to rule the world." That's not what Jesus was about. The true Messiah was completely different than the people imagined. And the people were blind to this spiritual reality. So the story of the 2 blind men, it is surrounding this central portion of Mark, and it emphasizes the fact that the disciples were also spiritually blind. They don't recognize that Jesus is going to his death. They don't. Instead, they believe Jesus, the son of David, he's going to be enthroned in his kingdom. And but Jesus, in this central portion of Mark, he's working to enlighten them, to heal their blindness, their spiritual blindness. How does Jesus work to heal their spiritual blindness? Well, he openly tells them 3 times in this part of Mark, he tells them 3 times that he is going to suffer and die. He tells them plainly, but they don't understand, because there's a bit of cognitive dissonance going on in their minds. They're blind to what type of Messiah Jesus would be. Each prediction of his suffering and death is followed by selfish actions of the disciples. They're selfish. They're looking to have a great high place in the kingdom, or they're thinking of themselves in to do with the kingdom in some way. And Jesus is trying to deal with their selfish actions. And I want to share the screen, if I can, and show you what I'm talking about in this structure. So let me see if I can do that. Let me do it. Now, I'll just come to here. Now, you see this picture I'm putting up? This is what I'm talking about here. So you see, we read the story in Mark chapter 8, where Jesus heals a blind man. And then if you look at the very bottom of this diagram, you see Jesus heals another blind man. That was Bartimaeus in in Mark chapter 10. And you notice all in between, Jesus is giving a prediction of his death. The first prediction, the second prediction, the third prediction.
Mm-hmm.
And each prediction is associated with the disciples doing something selfish. You know, Peter having his mind set on the things of man and not on the things of God.
Mm.
And then all the disciples in the next prediction, they're all thinking, who should be the greatest in the kingdom? You know, they were arguing about it. And then in the third prediction, when Jesus predicted, I'm going to die, James and John are asking for the highest place in the kingdom. And so Jesus is dealing with these disciples with their blindness. They don't understand what he's supposed to be as the Messiah. They think, oh, we're going to be enthroned and we're going to have a high place right next to Jesus.
Mm.
So Jesus is dealing with them. So with Peter, after Peter had his wrong ideas, Jesus told him about self-denial, cross-bearing. This is in Mark chapter 8. Self-surrender, And then in Mark chapter 9, you see with all the disciples wanting the greatest place. Who will be the greatest in the kingdom? He's saying the first shall be last, And if you want to be the first, you should be the last. And then he's dealing again in Mark chapter 10. If you want to be the greatest, you must be the servant of all. So you can read these stories. And you notice prior to all this taking place, we have the key question which Jesus asks. He asked the disciples, who am I? And the disciples recognize that he is the Christ, the Messiah. So the disciples weren't completely blind. They saw that Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah. But they didn't understand what sort of Messiah. And that's why you have Jesus giving those 3 different predictions, telling them, I'm going to die. I'm not what you think I am. They're thinking, oh, kingdom, glory, power. And Jesus is telling them, I'm not that. And he's trying to deal with their spiritual blindness. He's teaching them, I'm going to die. Well, let's come back to Mark chapter 8 and look at that key question which Jesus asks to begin this portion of the Bible. This key question, Mark chapter 8, verse 31. We're going to read there. Oh, no, this is the prediction, sorry. Oh, no, I want to go to the key question first. Hang on. It's before that. Okay. It's
29.
Mark chapter 33, yes. So we'll start with 31, that's all right, and we'll go down to 33. And he began to teach them, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. So this is the first prediction that Jesus makes of his suffering and death. He makes 2 other predictions. And then look what Peter reacts like. And he spake that saying openly. So he openly told them, I'm not what you think I am. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him. He began to rebuke Jesus. And when he had turned about and looked on his disciples, he rebuked Peter. He rebuked him back, saying, get thee behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not of the things of God, but the things that be of man. It's terrible. And then he goes into the teaching against selfishness. He says, lower down, that whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So he's saying, you want to follow me, Peter? It's different than what you think. Cross coming up. He says, for whoever will save his life shall lose it. So this is the first prediction of Jesus' suffering. There's another one in chapter 9 and another one also, 9 verse 31, the Son of Man delivered into the hands of men, killed, and after that, to rise again. And of course, another one in 10. But I want to come back and first look at the introduction to this bit. It's here, where Jesus, in verse 27 of Mark chapter 8, so Jesus is here, and he says, halfway through the verse, by the way, he asked his disciples, saying unto them, whom do men say that I am? Who are people saying that I am? And the disciples answered, John the Baptist, and some say Elias, and others one of the prophets. So the people were saying, this is who Jesus is. But he saith unto them, but whom say ye that I am? What about you, disciples? What do you think? And Peter answered and saith unto him, thou art the Christ.
Right.
And he charged them that they should tell no man of him. So let's talk about this a bit. This story here. It's interesting that right after Jesus heals the blind man, which we've read already, he's checking the spiritual vision of the people and then the disciples. Jesus asks the key question, who do the people say I am?
Yes.
But the people are blind. The people don't recognize Jesus as the Messiah. They say, oh, he's John the Baptist, he's Elijah, one of the prophets maybe. The people don't have the vision to see Jesus, who he really is. So then Jesus asked the disciples, and Peter is the spokesman of the disciples. He answers and says, you're the Christ. So the disciples, they have spiritual vision enough to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ. But the disciples cannot see clearly. Their ideas of the Messiah and his kingdom were wrong. Their beliefs had been colored by the popular beliefs of the day. Their beliefs had been flavored. And so they didn't see clearly. Although they could see him as the Messiah, they didn't see clearly. So think about the blind man there. The first blind man. The miracle where Jesus healed him and he touched him and he touched him twice. Did Jesus lack power? Why was it he had to touch him twice? This is the only miracle where Jesus ever touched a person twice. It's no lack of power on Jesus' part, is it? We know. But this appears to be an acted parable. Because the blind man sees, but he doesn't see clearly until the second action of Jesus. Let's read it again. And it says here, he looked up and he said, I see men as trees walking.
Yeah.
And then the second action of Jesus, after that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored, and the man, he saw every man clearly. So this is like an acted parable. This is like the 12 disciples. At first, they were blind men. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? But then they began to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. They were healed from their blindness. They gained spiritual vision. They believed in Jesus as the Messiah. But the disciples could not see clearly. They're like this blind man. They had a wrong idea of the Messiah, a wrong idea of his kingdom. They had selfish ideas. So, like the blind men, or the blind man here, in this case, the disciples need double healing or 2 touches of Christ to see clearly. 2 touches to clear the spiritual vision, if you like. And Jesus told the blind man to keep the miracle secret, not to tell anyone, not to make it publicly known, because the people had a wrong concept of the Messiah, and it would impact his mission as the Messiah, different from what the people understood. So often Jesus kept this secret, so it would not impact his mission as the Messiah. He was coming to die, and the people had a different idea of the Messiah. But the disciples, they never really gained spiritual vision. You see, they had the same thing. Here in Mark chapter 8, verse 29, it says, Peter sees, he says, "You are the Christ, thou art the Christ." And Jesus charged them that they should tell no man. That's in verse 30. So although the disciples had enough spiritual vision to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, they couldn't see clearly enough, because their ideas they shared with the people, and they had a wrong idea of the Messiah, as did the people. That's why Jesus said to keep it quiet, to keep it, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. And when you think about it, when did they have the second touch from Jesus? When were they finally healed from their blindness? It was not until Jesus rose again. He was walking on the road to Emmaus, and he was walking with two disciples, and these men had blinded vision to spiritual things. They said, "What happened? Why has this all happened?" They couldn't understand. And Jesus opened their eyes, and he said unto them, remember what he said to them. This is in Luke chapter 24. He said, "O fools," he calls them fools, "slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. You haven't even studied the word." He says, "Should not Christ have suffered all these things to enter into his glory?" And then Jesus explained all the scriptures to them. You remember that? That's in Luke 24. And so this was like healing to them. He opened the scriptures to them, and then they raced off back to Jerusalem. You remember the story, and came to the other disciples who were still muddling in darkness, still in their blindness. Why did this all happen? Why has Jesus died on the cross? They didn't understand, but they were healed, and they did understand later after the resurrection of Jesus. So there is a thing in the world called, okay, so a lot of people have complete blindness. They partially see, like the people. They said, "Oh, Jesus must have some kind of power. He must be John the Baptist risen again, Elijah, one of the other prophets." They had a little bit of vision. The disciples had a bit more spiritual vision. They said, "This is the Christ. Yeah, this is him." But they only had partial vision. It's like, when I take my glasses off, everything's blurry. I can't see properly. I can see, but not everything clearly.
Not exactly clear, yeah.
And so this is the problem with a lot of people. And it's also the problem of God's church in the last days. What does it say? In Revelation chapter 3, verse 17 and 18, it says, "You're blind." The church of Laodicea, we're blind. Yes. What do we need? We need eye salve, some healing stuff. So the church of the last day has partial vision. A lot of people, we keep the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath day and all that. But sometimes we're missing things, or we don't fully understand the word, how to keep the 10 Commandments. We're trying to do it on our own or something. There is such a thing as having partial spiritual vision, having blind spots where you can't see. And so we need to be healed from these things. from our blind spots. So the whole central portion of Mark, the book of Mark, is all about blindness, spiritual blindness. And it's around today, it's everywhere. You talk to people in other churches, they don't see clearly. And then we ourselves sometimes fail. And because they had wrong ideas of the Messiah, and these wrong ideas of the Messiah were so widespread in their day, it would, Jesus kept himself fairly secret. Often he kept his miracles secret. Often he told them not to tell people who he was.
Yes.
He'd come to die for the sins of the people and to be resurrected again. And having a wrong idea, the people would interfere with that work. Even Peter wanted to interfere with that. He said, no, this will not happen to you, Jesus. You won't die. They wanted to interfere with Jesus' mission.
Yeah.
He didn't come to be crowned an earthly king. And that's what people are even trying today. They're trying to make God's kingdom an earthly kingdom.
Yes.
Everywhere, you see it. But remember, God's plans are not our plans. God's ways are not our ways. Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9.
Yeah.
What does it say?
His
ways are not our ways.
Ways are higher.
God does the opposite of what we think often.
Yeah.
It was the opposite of what they were thinking. And sometimes we don't even realize it. And the majority of people don't see God's way. So let's talk about, so that central portion of Mark includes also other things. The content that I haven't spoke about yet. The 3 predictions of Jesus' death. He gives 3 predictions. It also includes Jesus' teachings against selfishness, transfiguration of Jesus. Remember when he was made all glorious and the disciples were there, 3 of them? And the purpose of the transfiguration was to strengthen the faith of the disciples so they wouldn't fail when it came to the death of Jesus. So, and also, you know, during the transfiguration, Jesus also gives a mini prediction of his death also there. He also predicts his death in that portion of Mark. In Mark chapter 9, verses 9, 10, and 12, if you read it. Mark chapter 9. So that's the transfiguration and a mini prediction of his death. So this whole portion, Jesus is saying, I'm going to die. You think I'm going to be an earthly king, but I'm going to die. And the disciples weren't ready for it. Even in that further, another story in that portion of Mark, the disciples were given the power to heal. And they failed to heal a certain man or a certain case, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's due to, what did Jesus say? These ones only are healed by fasting and prayer. And this is what was missing with the disciples. When they came to Gethsemane, what happened? Did they pray? No. They were not praying. They fell into temptation. They were not ready. They were not ready for Jesus to die. Here's the pivotal thing, the death of Jesus, you know, the greatest temptation, and they failed. So we have this picture, the Gospel of Mark, 2 blind men representing the blind disciples, blind Bartimaeus, you know, and the unknown blind man. And the question is, are we also spiritually blind? You know, it's almost like we cannot tell. You know, what man can know his own blindness? You know, that's what happens these days when someone has too much power and they rule a nation, or they don't know their own blind spots. They're not even aware of their own blind spots. And so no one man is all adequate, you know, to rule a nation and to not have a blind spot. They all do. And this is where men have too much power in themselves. They can bring a nation to disaster because we're all the same. We should not count ourselves superior to the disciples.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk in this last section of our sermon about two more stories. Mark chapter 14. This there. I'm just going to paraphrase. We may read some verses, but here we have in Mark chapter 14. Here the chief priests and the scribes, they're looking for a way to put Jesus to death. And they want to do it subtly. They want to do it sneaky, you know, catch Jesus off guard. And then we enter into another story, a different story. This is where the woman pours the precious perfume on Jesus. And then we go back to the other story about the Judas here in verse 10. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went unto the chief priests to betray him unto them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought how he might conveniently betray him. So here we have the story of Judas and the chief priests ready to betray Jesus, the secret plot. Now, this story is like brackets to another story within. Do you notice that? And this bracketed story, the opposite things are occurring. So this is like another literary structure toward the end of John. There's the story of the plot to kill Jesus. And this story of the plot, it brackets another story. It brackets the story of the woman who anoints Jesus with the precious perfume. And the two characters, we've got this woman, she's doing the opposite of the other character, Judas. Two characters doing the opposite actions. So it's like an ironic contrast going on. The woman's amazing gift to Jesus stands in contrast to the treacherous betrayal of Judas. And the woman, we know this is Mary, but in Mark, she's unnamed. But you notice here, Judas, he's named. It says Judas Iscariot, one of the 12. It's a name. And the value of her gift is mentioned as 300 pence back in verse 5. And the price of his price, it's only the promise of money. So you have all these contrasting thoughts, right? Her amount was definite. His amount is just the promise. He's willing to betray Jesus just for a little bit of money, just for the promise of money, not even having money. And the dinner guests here, they're appalled at the waste of money. You know, what a waste of money. A year's worth of wages spent on the perfume poured out on Jesus' head. This is an act of love toward Jesus. And Jesus interposes and defends her here and says in this verse in 9 that wherever this gospel is preached around the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial for her. So this would be a memorial, something that would be never forgotten. And the deed of Judas was never forgotten either, but in a different way. He agrees to betray Jesus. And his act of love to Jesus is what? Her act of love is to pour the precious ointment on him, to kiss his feet, to wipe it with her hair. What is Judas' act of love toward Jesus? He kisses him. And Jesus says, you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? His act is a false act of love. Compare that with the act of the woman. It's the opposite. Her act is an act of true love.
Love, yes.
To Jesus. That he saved her from a life of sin. That's interesting, isn't it? How you have one story within another, and then the two characters doing the opposite thing. One showing supreme love to Jesus, the other a false love, ready to betray him. Interesting. Right, the second bracketed story I want to talk about at the end of in Mark, which I found really amazing. Really, we need to study the scripture to open this up to our minds. Jesus goes through two trials, right? The trial before the Sanhedrin, that's in Mark chapter 14, verse 53 onwards, before the chief priests, if you like. Jesus goes through another trial. That starts in Mark chapter 15 onwards. That's a trial before Pilate. And in between these two trials, there's another story going on. You know what that story in between is? That bracketed story? That's the story of Peter betraying, not Peter. Yeah, Peter. Peter not betraying Jesus, but Peter denying Jesus. That's what I'm saying. So that story in between is Peter denying Jesus. So again, you have the opposite things occurring, where Jesus is being tried and giving a faithful testimony to the priests, to Pilate. And inside, Peter is, in the story inside, Peter is denying Jesus and lying and giving an unfaithful testimony, doing the opposite action. So those are the two stories within a story. Jesus is being tried, giving a faithful testimony inside in the courtrooms. And Peter is outside the court giving a lying report. Two characters doing the opposite actions. One giving a faithful testimony, the other a false. And 3 times Peter is accosted by strangers, by bystanders, by the servants of the priests, 3 times. And each time he denies having anything to do with Jesus. I don't have any association with Jesus, he says. He curses and swears even. And at this point, the rooster crows the second time. And Peter suddenly remembers the prophecy of Jesus. He remembers the prophecy of Jesus that he would deny his Lord 3 times that very night, and he weeps and breaks down. Now, so the opposites are very striking, but let's read in Mark 14, verse 65. This is toward the end of the trial of Jesus before the priests. And just before we go into the story of Peter's denial, it says, and some of them began to spit on him and to cover his face and to buffet him and to say unto him, prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. So this is the end of the first trial before the second trial.
65.
Jesus is blindfolded. Yeah, that's in verse 65, Mark 14, verse 65. Jesus is blindfolded and he's struck on the forehead and commanded to prophesy. The idea is to mock Jesus, who couldn't see, who was blind by the blindfold. Tell us then, you're blind. You can't see. Who struck you? But at the very time they're doing this, Peter is below in the courtyard denying Jesus and fulfilling one of Jesus' prophecies. Did you get that?
Yeah.
Just at this moment when they're hitting Jesus and saying, prophesy, one of Jesus' prophecies is coming true. Because Peter's there denying him. And 3 times. Because that's the story in between, you see. So in denying Jesus, Peter is demonstrating that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. Jesus is a prophet. So by Peter doing what he's doing, he's fulfilling the very words of Jesus. And I just find it interesting how Jesus at that time, they blindfold him. And yet his prophecies are coming true,
Yep.
even not seeing. So this story is all about blindness. Even you can't even blindfold. You put a blindfold on Jesus, and he can still see.
Mm.
You can't blind him. And what a contrast we see to poor old blind Peter. He didn't understand about the Messiah, and that Jesus was going to his death. He just couldn't get it into his mind that Jesus would allow himself to be taken and that Jesus would go and die. And therefore, he wasn't ready for it. He hadn't prayed. In Gethsemane, he wasn't ready. He denied Jesus. All of what Jesus said was fulfilled. This is the blindness of Peter. What a contrast to Jesus. So it is interesting that Peter did recognize in Mark chapter 8, he did recognize him as the Christ.
Yeah.
And in Mark chapter 14, verse 31, he said, I will never deny you, Jesus.
Yes. Oh,
But the lack of preparation to stand faithful.
Mm.
He should have been praying the night away. Instead, he was sleeping the night away. In Mark chapter 14, verse 37, 38, it says he was sleeping.
Works.
Okay, so we need sleep. But at a crisis in life, sometimes it's better to pray and deny yourself some sleep.
Right.
Not the most important thing sometimes in life. I want to read in closing. Here we have a thing, Christ Triumphant, page 219. It says, there was never a time when Christian men and women in all walks of life were in so great need of clear spiritual eyesight as of now. So we need clear spiritual eyesight because we're going to face crises as well in our lives. They had crises. It is not safe to lose sight of Christ for one moment. His followers must pray and believe and love him fervently. That's what it says there. It's really important for us to have clear spiritual vision, lest we be like the disciples and we be overcome by temptation in these last days when we're going to face crises of our faith, our way of worship being threatened, forced to worship a false day or anything. So the 12 disciples, we are like them. We need to be healed from our blindness, our spiritual blindness. The church of the last days is Laodicea. And it says in Revelation 3 verse 7 that you are blind.
No.
It doesn't say you're half blind. It says you are blind and you need the eye salve, the heavenly eye salve to take away the spiritual darkness. In Reflecting Christ, page 111, I want to share that with you. It says, when our eyes are anointed with the holy eye salve, we shall be able to detect the precious gems of truth, even though they may be buried beneath the surface. So there's a lot in the Word of God that we don't know about. You won't know about it unless you have that heavenly eye salve. And I have another reading to share with you as well about the eye salve. It talks about here, it goes on, it says here in this reading, it says that it is next to impossible for human beings to separate the sacred from the common, the divine from the human. It says it's impossible for us on our own. Yeah, we see this happening today, the Sabbath keeping, people are mixing the common with the, with the holy. People don't keep the Sabbath as they should these days. And it's impossible. Well, it's impossible, it says, as humans we are. And, our human way, we don't know God's way. But it says, God is working for his people that they may not be left in darkness. He would have us anoint our eyes with eye salve that we may discern between the workings of the powers of darkness and the movings of God's spirits, Spirit of God. So it's saying these two things. That comes from 1888 article. I'm not sure what article, December 1888, those materials. Anyway, so we have a problem, and we want to address it and not be blind to spiritual things in these last days and be asleep. It says in Mark chapter 13 to watch and pray that we are not caught. And that at that time, when the master returns, it says that we are to watch and pray that we are not caught out. When the master returns from his work in the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. Because we know probation will close one day. And we need to be ready for that day and be fully aware and awake and not sleeping. What verse is that? Watch and pray. This is in Mark chapter 13, verse 33. Take heed and watch and pray, for you know not when the time is. We don't know. So we need to be wide awake and not sleeping disciples, not blind disciples of Jesus, you know, having partial eyesight in these things. Amen. Let's close.
Amen. Yes, thank you.
Amen.
Yes.